Hello everyone, welcome back to another video in the tutorial series of remaking the core version of Getaway Shootout. In the last video we focused on implementing the map manager, so now the players progress through the maps as they finish each map. So when one player finishes, it then jumps to the next map, which is map number 2, and so forth. Just continuing through, looping through all the maps that we defined in the array until one player has finished and the game is over. So at this point in the game is pretty close to being a full kind of core version of the original game. And the next thing I want to do is to just implement some simple UI to kind of wrap up the game and to make it playable by a user. Because at this point, there is no way of telling how many wins you have. So you have no clue if you're close to winning the game or pretty far away. Because as right there, one player has won by reaching the max score. And yeah, it's important for the player playing the game to know what the current score is at. And just to refresh your memory, so the score in the game is just the number of times the player has reached the finish object. And when that score reaches the max score, which is set to 3, the player then wins the game like this. So in this video, we'll be implementing that scoreboard UI, and then perhaps in future videos, we'll be doing other UI kind of just to make the game a lot more playable and easier to interact with. So to create the scoreboard UI, we'll actually have to create a UI component. And actually before we do that, we'll have to create a UI canvas. So if I jump over here and go to the UI tab and click canvas, this creates a Unity game canvas. More specifically, this is a canvas for all your UI elements in the game. So I'm just going to create that, and it creates this rectangle, which is corresponding to the game camera. If you want it to be actually in the world space, say like on a screen on an object, you can click that and scale down to actually something in your world. But since this kind of scoreboard UI is going to be always on the camera and at the top, something like the screen space overlay is going to be a good render mode for this UI setup. So the next thing to do is to actually create a holder for our scoreboard. So I'm going to create an empty game object, and I'm going to call this scoreboard. And this is going to hold all of the players' scores, which are just the text objects. And currently, how the UI system works is there's this whole kind of anchor window to change your UI's anchor, and also just to change the scale or change the width, the height, and so forth. I'm going to hold Shift and Alt and click the top anchor point here to have it nicely kind of anchored at the top, and then also just scaled to the full size of the screen. But if you're curious about learning more about these like anchor points and kind of navigating this UI here, definitely check out just the Unity tutorials because they'll nicely explain this whole kind of setup with the anchor system. So now that we have this holder in place, the next thing to do is to actually create a score element, and this is just going to be a text component. So if I go to UI, you can see there's this text, and then it's Text Mesh Pro. So this actually has changed in a recent version of Unity, maybe Unity 6, because the default is actually in Legacy. This was just the original text object. But yeah, it got replaced by this Text Mesh Pro, and we'll just be using then the default. But it actually then asks us to import kind of just the essentials of this component. So I'll just click that button to import. And then now we should be set up with the default Unity text. So if you're used to the old text in the Unity UI system, this should be pretty similar. I think it just gives you more capabilities. But we'll see as we're implementing this scoreboard UI if there's any other changes. Now with these text objects, the goal of kind of this text object is to display the player's score. So this will just be a number, so 0, 1, 2, 3, and just increasing till we hit the max score. So I'll just give it a default value of 0. And then I'll also change the alignment of this. I'll align it to the center, and then I'll align it to the middle in the vertical direction. So this sort of text box I'm setting up just for one player's score. The goal is to actually have multiple text objects, each for a player's score. So something like this, if I duplicate it, you can see it actually creates another text object right on top of the other one, which is not what we want. We want these kind of just be spaced out across the screen, each one for a player score. So one way of doing this automatically is actually with the built-in Unity script. If I go to the scoreboard root component, the game object, and I look up layout, there is this horizontal layout group, which will actually, if we add, you can already see it has adjusted our scores to be kind of evenly spaced. And this looks pretty good, but it is kind of off-centered. As you can see with these text boxes, they're not expanding to the full size of what they can be. And one way to change that is actually to go to this layout group and have this width checkbox to be checked to true for the controlled child size. And what this will do now is to actually expand this whole text box to be the full size it can be, which is just for 2 elements, that's half the screen width. Now if I create more elements, you can see it nicely just evenly splits each text box to be the total screen size divided by the number of elements. So that looks good. I'm just going to delete the rest of the elements except one, and I'll actually control the child size on the height too, just so it expands to the full height of our holder text box here, or rect transform. So I'll just rename this text because this will be the player score corresponding to one player score. And what we want to do now is to actually have this player score be instantiated the number of times that is corresponding to the number of players in the game. So if there's 4 players in the game, we want this to be instantiated 4 times, corresponding to 4 players. So to dynamically create the number of player scores to the number of players, we'll be using a script, and I'll actually attach that script to this scoreboard rect transform. Before I do that, I'll again just remove that, and the script that I'll be creating, I'll actually navigate to the UI scripts folder, because this will just be a nice spot to put a script that is managing the UI for this game object. So if I go to scripting, create a script, and this script is going to be just dealing with all the scoreboard UI, so I'll just call it scoreboard and then UI. So now with the script that we created, I'm just going to quickly add that to that object that I was talking about. And so now we have the scoreboard UI attached, and then with the player score as the first child of this object. And we'll be using this player score to actually create multiple player scores and then changing the text to align with the actual score of the game. So I'll open up the scoreboard UI script, and this is where we can begin to start creating that functionality. So now the first thing that we want to do is create the number of player score text to the number of players that are in the game. So in the start method, we'll do something like this. That player score text is currently just the first child of this transform. And we can do something then like transform.getChild 0.gameObject, and that will give us a reference to the scoreboard text. That scoreboard text for the player score. And I'll just call it something like game object score object equals that first game object. And it is important to note we could have this reference actually just be a prefab by putting it up here and making it a public reference. But this way is maybe just a bit more lazy. We're just getting the game object reference just from that first child in our transform, and then using that to now instantiate the score object. And importantly, we want to instantiate it with the exact same parent as this object. So that is just our transform. And this will in effect duplicate that score object one time, but we want to do this for the amount of players that we have in the scene. So if I do something then like for loop and loop through the number of players, and then instantiate for each player a score object. So this code in theory works, but one thing we are missing is crucially the number of players that we have in our game. And for this, there are two options I see. We could do something like getting the game manager, so get component or find object by type, game manager, and then somehow getting that number of players from the game manager. But I'm going to do a second approach, which is actually for the game manager to communicate with the scoreboard script here. So instead of reaching out to the game manager will actually call a function on our script. That way we don't have to worry about finding the game manager and knowing what variable to collect. It is just going to pass in all the data for us to actually create this initial scoreboard object. So I'm just going to remove this up here, and instead of doing this on start, I'm going to make this a public void and then name it a function for initialization. So I'll just call it initialization like that, or maybe just a init for short. And as I was saying, we want the game manager to actually pass in data to this scoreboard, or to actually initialize it. And that's importantly the number of players. But we'd also want the initial scores of each players to set for each scoreboard or score text object. And one convenient way to do that is actually just to pass the array. So int scores. This is an integer array of all the players' scores in our game. And from this array, we can just get the size like that. So at this point, we have created the necessary amount of player score text. The next thing to do is to actually set each text to be the actual score of the player. But before we do that, one thing I noticed is with this for loop, we'll actually create an error here because we're creating one extra scoreboard object since we already have one initially in the scene. So just a slight change if we set this to 1. That way we ignore the first scoreboard object because it's already in the game. So below this is where I'll actually set each player's score to the correct player's score in this game state, which is passed in right here. So if I do something like 4, again, just going through the scores.length and just getting the child at the I index and then getting the component of that text render. And again, this has actually changed a little since when I was using Unity for Getaway Shootout. Instead of actually just being text, which is the original Unity UI text system, it is now Text Mesh Pro. So I believe then it is something like TMP underscore text to actually get that Text Mesh Pro class. So if I do that, it'll import the TM Pro library, and then now I can, I guess, set text or just text. Usually I am used to just setting text directly since that's how you did it in the original UI system. So I'll just do something like that. And we just want to set it to be the score of that player. So scores of the I index player. And we'll have to actually go to toString to convert an integer to a string for this text. Okay, so at this point, we have initialized the scoreboard with the starting scores. The other step to do is actually create another function to update the scores. So when a round is finished in the game, a player's score has increased, and we want to rewrite all the scores to be the updated scores in our game. And from here, you can see that this sort of segment right here is just that function. This is updating the scores. So I'm actually going to remove it. If I can remove it, and then remove it like that, and just create another function. I'll call it something like update scores, and we'll pass in that integer array of scores again, and then just paste in that code from before. So now we have a public function that any script can call. We also now have to call it again in our initial function, just to set it to be the initial scores for our script. Okay, so now at this point we have a script, a UI script that is handling the initialization and updating the scores. The next thing to do is to actually connect this to the actual game state, because currently there's nothing calling this init function. And as I was mentioning before, this is a job that we can put in the game manager. So if I jump to the game manager, we'll actually then now create a reference to this scoreboard UI. And an easy way to do this is to actually just create a public reference that we assign in the editor. So if I do something like scoreboard UI and set that reference to scoreboard UI, we can now use this scoreboard UI to initialize the starting scores. So I'll just do this in the wake function here, and I'll just do it in the middle here to do some UI initialization. So again, we reference it as scoreboard UI, and the function that we want to call is just init, and we have to pass in the scores to initialize with. And from previous videos, the current score of all the players is actually in the game state. So if I jump to that class, we see we have that array of all the players' scores, but it actually is private, so we are not able to access it. What I'll do to make this accessible is just create a getter function, something like public int get scores, and then just return the player's score. But this perhaps isn't ideal since we're returning a reference to this int array, and arrays are kind of special where this return reference, if you edit it on, say, the game manager, it would actually change this local reference as well, this array player score, which might not be ideal since we only want to change it on round over. So it could be in the future changing this just to int, and then you pass in the index of the player, something like that, and return the player's score index. But I think this will just be a simple way to get moving for right now, and I'll save that. So back in our game manager, we now have a way to get the current scores. If I do state.get scores, this will return the integer array of scores, and then we'll call the scoreboard init with those scores. Okay, at this point we have initialized the scoreboard. The last thing is to do is to actually connect up the scoreboard UI to the game state when the game state changes. Because at this point, the scoreboard UI is just going to stay the same. For every round, it'll just be initialized and never changed, even when a player finishes, which is what we don't want. So to connect this up, I'm going to jump actually back to the game state. And a nice way to do this is to actually have some sort of event that gets triggered every time we change the player's score. So that's what I'll do. I'll go up here, create a public event, and the event will pass in the integer score of each player. So an int array is going to be the parameters passing, and I'll call this on score changed, or to something like that effect. And basically now all we have to do is call this whenever we change the score, and we change it only on round over. So on round over, I'll invoke it with the new player score. If the player score was changing externally or changing in multiple places of our game state, we could make some sort of getter setter methods for the player score. But it does get a little more complicated if it is an array. But just having this one-time event and round over is going to be good enough to signal that our score has changed. So I'm going to save that and jump back to Game Manager, because the last thing to do is to connect this event up with the actual UI. So if I do state on score change, and then I'll just subscribe to it by doing the plus equal like before, and the method that we actually want to subscribe with is not going to be a method inside this game manager. We'll actually do it from the scoreboard UI, and that's just going to be that update scores method that we created. Because importantly, the update scores accepts an integer array of scores, which this on score change will pass in with the updated scores. Now I'll save that. And there's one important thing to note. At this point, there would be a pretty bad bug in the game, and this is because this game state is set to be a static variable. So this game state would obviously persist between multiple scene loads, which is why we created it static. We want the game state to be the same between different rounds. But if we never unsubscribe from this on-score change, we will just keep adding to this event listener and making a huge array of all these listeners to previous scoreboards. And I believe whenever this scoreboard UI gets destroyed at the end of the game, it won't unsubscribe from this on-score change. So we'll have, again, just a big list of previous scoreboards that are already destroyed. And this would cause potentially errors, but also just performance issues if we go long enough throughout the game without ever unsubscribing and clearing this list. So what I'll do down here is to do something like on destroy, and we'll do something like state _, change, and then just using the unsubscribe syntax to do scoreboard.ui to unsubscribe from that event. And now when I'm thinking about it just right now, we're doing this on destroy. We could do something like state.reset all events, something like this. And this could be a function on the state to just clear all the events when we go to the next scene. This would just prevent, say if we forgot to actually unsubscribe from one of the events for the state. But since there's only one event, I'll just leave this how it is right now. And this could actually be changed in the future if the game requires it or it gets more complex. So I saved that script now. The next thing to do is to actually test this. So I'm going to jump to our scene and click play, and hopefully we should see some scores on the screen. We don't, we get an error. Okay, so that's actually because we never set the scoreboard UI reference, because this is a reference that we just created in our script. So I'm just going to drag that scoreboard as the reference, as the reference there, and then try it out now. Okay, so playing the game, we now see 4 scores at the top of the screen, and hopefully when one player finishes, the score increases for that player. If we play again and make it to the end, oh wow, he teleported me out. Wow, that was actually pretty impressive. He teleported me outside the end zone. I haven't seen that. So again, another player finished and the score increased. One thing I want to check is it should increase, yeah, it increases right at the end score, and that's due to the scoreboard being updated with that event. So everything appears to be working. That is just kind of a simple UI. Obviously, so in the original game, the text has a font that's that like pixel font, so it looks a little better, and maybe I'll do that at the end of the, or after the end of this video. And then the other thing is, in the original game, there's nice player character icons for each score, because right now there's no way of telling who's who. It just assumed that you're the first player here. But currently in the game, we don't have any characters and any character sprites in the game. They're all just the same. So I'll just leave this just as text characters across the scoreboard. And if characters get implemented, we can just include that there. Okay, so that is wrapping up the scoreboard UI system in the game. In the next video, I think I'll just maybe do another UI video showing you how to maybe update the player UI, perhaps the health, or the, what else is the player keep track of? Oh, the power-ups, perhaps showing the ammo on the screen. But yeah, at this point, we're getting pretty close to a core version of the game. So yeah, excited to see if anyone takes the game further, and if you are curious in making your own maps, you can create it with the core version. So see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.